Hey, welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. I spoke today to Jonathan Gottschall, who is a scholar of storytelling. His academic background is in the science of storytelling, and he's written a couple of books on storytelling, the most recent of which is The Story Paradox, which is what we spend most of our time on today. He had also written a book before that called The Storytelling Animal. He's a distinguished fellow at Washington and Jefferson College, and he argues that human beings can no more give up narrative than breathing or sleeping. And so the question then is, why are stories so important to us? Why do stories have such a grip on the human imagination? And he argues now that the primary function of storytelling is to sway the listener in some way, to change how they think or feel about something or someone. Stories, he writes, are influence machines. And so part of the political divide that we have today is a divide of the story of America, for example. Are we a city on a hill, a beacon of hope and light and liberty and progress? Or is America an oppressive, supremacist and bloody empire? And so in a deep sense, then the culture war is a story war. And in light of recent political developments, Jonathan says our task now is to save the world from stories. In part, he says, by trying to tell stories without villains, which is obviously very difficult. So along the way, we talk about the difference between the suspension of disbelief and narrative transportation. Obviously, we talk about politics quite a lot, but we also talk about the role of religion and religious stories, about the role of luck, and the lack of political pluralism in academia. I came away from the conversation, if anything, even more convinced about the power of stories, but thinking a lot about our decisions about which stories we choose to immerse ourselves in. I think it's obviously a two-way relationship between us and the story, as well as in the way that stories layer on top of each other in a sort of narrative collage, if you like. And so it's left me with a lot to think about, even having read his work and engaged with him today. And I do think that the role of story in our lives is something that we should think more about. And so I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. So, Jonathan, welcome to Dialogues. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's start with your story about why you're interested in stories. How did you end up becoming so interested in stories? And how do you think about the story you tell yourself about your own journey, if you like?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. I actually always have trouble kind of recollecting my past well enough to figure out how I ended up on this road. And then as soon as I do end up recollecting it, I start getting suspicious of how much of this is a true story and how much of it is fictional. But I'll tell it anyway. It probably began back in graduate school. I went to get a PhD as an English literature specialist, hoping to be a professor someday when I grew up. And it was the 90s, and it was the height of the sort of postmodern deconstructionist era. And I came in with very high aspirations and very, I guess, maybe even a naively romantic view of what was possible in terms of knowledge acquisition, that we could hopefully understand some of the phenomenon we study in a more durable and a more reliable way, in a way that can withstand the scrutiny of ensuing generations, rather than just the way it has always seemed to me in the academic humanities generally and in literary study particularly, that we're just chasing our tails around in perpetuity, never getting anywhere, just chasing our tails until we drill ourselves down into the earth. And I thought there must be some way to, I don't know, actually figure things out. And I began casting around.
Find some sort of bottom, so it's not just narrative all the way down, I guess.
Well, and so we're just not playing a game of status acquisition or something. Where we're being professors and we're doing our research. It's really just we're just competing with each other to get more Vita ink, and we're competing each other to get better honors and better professorships or whatever. I wanted to figure things out about these really, really important questions, especially about why human beings are storytelling animals. This is a very strange activity for any creature to be involved in, to spend hours and hours of their day, every day, involved in these sorts of narratives, and oftentimes completely fictional narratives. I mean, ask yourself, for the audience, why is it that human beings spend hours of their day, every day, hanging on, riveted by the fake struggles of pretend people. This is time that could be spent in a multitude of other ways. We could be spending it with our families. We could be spending it wooing mates. We could be spending it learning a language or an instrument. So this is just a giant mystery at the core of the human condition. How do we become creatures of narrative? How do we become creatures of art, this kind of art-obsessed, art-infatuated ape? And I actually wanted something like real answers to it, something like the answers that scientists come up with. And so I started to wonder, is it possible that we can just go and raid the sciences and raid their theories and some of their data, and especially their methods, and apply them to traditional humanities subject matter? And at this time, I felt very alone in that effort. But it turned out, as I got deeper into it, there was this whole science, a new science of narrative psychology emerging. And narrative psychology, I define it as the study of how our brains naturally shape stories and are in turn naturally shaped by stories. And this science was forming with inputs from people like me, a little bit on the edges, but mainly by actual psychologists and neuroscientists and some communication scholars, some business scholars. It was a very big tent of interdisciplinary scholars. And in general, they were finding these kind of amazing and sort of obvious, but also sort of counterintuitive results that stories have a lot more power in our lives than most of us are aware of on a day-to-day basis. So, if you ask people are stories powerful? They'll say yeah, but they don't really treat them that way. They're not on guard against stories. And I realize that I'm about to just recite my entire book. I'll go on for 2 hours here, so I'll stop there and maybe move on to another question.
Well, it's great. Well, that's one of the great pleasures of being a book writer, is that you can then just spend hours talking about your book to anybody that gets on. I
actually don't enjoy it. I actually hate the talking part of it. I like the writing part of it, but I don't like the talking part of it.
Why not?
I feel like, the reason I became a writer, I realized, just during doing publicity for this book, the reason I became a writer is because I am uncomfortable talking. And when you write, you have this magical power. And here's the magic is. It's a time machine. It's the art of time travel. And you get to go back in history over and over and over again until you can actually phrase yourself in the way you meant to communicate, in the way you meant to be heard. Even just that sentence I said right then, I would then go back and polish it and make it better. And so you have this incredible control as a writer over your communication. Whereas when you're speaking, it's always this sort of high wire act. And I don't know about you, but I always feel like when I do a conversation like this, I always feel like it's a little bit like being given a public pop quiz on your own book. And, but it's public, and so you might, you might qualify. Yeah, you might get it wrong. Yeah.
You might forget something.
I will forget. Yeah.
Or you'll get Plato mixed up with Socrates. Or
absolutely.
I remember I was on the radio once. This was in the UK, and I made a statement that I realized on the way home could only be true if the American War of Independence had taken place 100 years later than it actually did. I can't remember what it was, but it was something like, I said something like the founders had been influenced by some early 19th century thinkers or something. And I was in a taxi on the way home, and my face burned crimson with shame.
Oh yeah, I'm almost always mortified. Almost always mortified over how I've conducted myself in an interview like this. Sometimes over just like something massive like that, but other times just like, oh golly, I just rambled my way through this or that response.
Okay, well, let me just take all the anxiety away. We have a very friendly audience on my podcast. There's a select audience, but it's interesting in the context of storytelling, and this wasn't where I was planning to go next. But when you have this lovely picture in your book of a story being told in a tribe, you'll remember the name now, but if it's very oral, and you're thinking about, most of the traditions of storytelling is oral, and there's something about the way you can tell a story with your voice, I was just thinking, for example, we had our neighbors over the other day, and all three of us told the classic, we're in a new era, how did you meet? What's your story? And we compete to tell the story in the funniest way or the most romantic way. And we're using our voice, and we're using touch, and we're using so on. And so isn't there also something from a storytelling point of view, something a bit more powerful about doing it orally rather than on the page? So you lose some precision, perhaps. But don't you gain persuasive power?
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah, I'm sure you gain so much more if you're a good story performer. If you feel like you're a good performer, the picture in the book is a picture of Khoisan Bushmen, and it's from 1947, I believe, and the image is called "The Storyteller," and the audience can look it up.
I'll put it online. It's beautiful.
Beautiful. Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. It's one of my very favorite photographs that's ever been taken. You know, I have it up on my wall over here, and what's cool about it is you have the Khoisan storyteller at the center of the picture, and he's got his hands up in the air, and there's a ring of young people around him, maybe 15 or 20 young people, all the tribes, adolescents and children, and the storyteller is an elder, and he's got his hands up in the air, and it's like, to me, he looks like he's a conductor, and he's like literally orchestrating all of the feelings in these people's hearts, all of the thoughts in their minds. He's brought them into hormonal harmony with one another and neurological attunement. We'd be able to show these things. We brought these people into the lab today. He's wielding this enormous power, and he's only doing so with his, his simple story, his expressive hands, his expressive face. It's this enormous power. Mm-hmm. And I thought the image is just so expressive of the power that storytellers wield over us. They kind of bring us into this sort of like, if you go to a movie theater and you sit down in the front row, and instead of watching the screen, you turn around and you watch the people behind you. This is another great illustration of the power storytellers wield. What are you going to see? You're going to see a bunch of hypnotized zombies who are just staring blank at the screen, their jaws hanging. They're like puppets controlled by invisible wires. Again, that storyteller is orchestrating all of the thoughts in their heads, all the images, all the feelings, and has brought that whole theater into a condition of emotional, intellectual, neurological, hormonal, physiological attunement. And again, this is what has drawn me to the subject matter of storytelling, this vast power storytellers wield, and the increasingly clear sense that this power isn't always wielded in the best interests of humanity.
So for good or for bad, and I should say that in your previous book you focused more on the good and this one more on the bad. But I was thinking a bit about some of Joseph Henrich's work. I had him on earlier too, but looking at religious traditions and how it's important. You say the same words, you listen to the same words, even you kind of move together. And so that's a slightly different thing because there you're participating in the story. And so the way you just described the people in the theatre was kind of quite a negative one. But you can also imagine, like from the photograph you just referred to, there's also something very beautiful about sharing the energy of almost dissolving temporarily the edges of your individuality and becoming part of that shared story. And there's so, I mean, we're always going to talk a lot about the negative, but that's the huge upside, right? The synchrony and sense of shared story.
It's one of the best things about being human. My most recent book is the one I guess we're talking about mainly today. Is called The Story Paradox. And the paradox that I'm talking about is that stories are at the same time simply the best and most constructive force on earth, and also the worst and most destructive force on earth. So all of that ambiguity of storytelling and all of that clash of bright and dark is encapsulated in that image of the Khoisan storyteller. Because again, just let me give you an example of this. Like, that book, the first book I wrote about storytelling was called The Storytelling Animal. It's more about the positives of storytelling, like you said. And I also included that Khoisan image in that book as well. And there was a certain group of people who I expected to be attracted to that book. People who were like English literature types. People who were interested in popular science. I had a certain idea of who would be attracted to the book in mind. But you know who else was attracted to it? People in the trades of communication and persuasion. Political people, marketing people. And what they saw in that image was not, something warm and fuzzy. They saw power. They saw power in that image. And they said, oh, storytelling is how I can get a piece of that power. The power of storytelling. So one of the big points of my work is that stories aren't good. Almost all of us can't help but think of story with positive connotations, or think of them as good things. But stories aren't good. They're just powerful. And I think of them actually as sort of like mercenaries, or the force of story is like a mercenary that as willingly sells itself to the bad guys as to the good guys.
That's a great analogy, actually. I think in your book you refer to stories as of necessary poison. And I think it's interesting. I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but in that photograph, do we know what story is being told?
I looked into that very, very hard. I do have some sense for it. I know it was. Here's what I actually wrote a different version of the book, not different, an earlier draft of the book when I thought I had pinned down what the story was, and it was what was it about? It was about. The short answer to the question, I don't want to take up time on this. The short answer to the question is I don't exactly know. It's a trickster. It's a trickster tale about the trickster figure, the Jackal.
So it's kind of a warning, perhaps, in some ways. And it feels pedagogic just looking at it. There's obviously a lot of young people in the picture too. And the reason I think it's worth spending a bit of time on it is because it does illustrate your point, is that if we subsequently learned that what he was actually doing was telling a story about how the tribe over the valley were possessed by evil demons, and that we should therefore, under the cover of nightfall, go and slaughter all of them. We might feel slightly differently about that picture than what we probably assume, which is that it's something more positive. And so absent the knowledge of the story he's telling, all we know is that they are gripped, and that's that verb gripping. I think it appears in your work too. It's like that's the best thing you can say about a novel, isn't it? You say someone's gripped, and on a blurb, if you're a novelist, what you want is gripping, or something like that, unputdownable, and you do get drawn into it. Which is actually a good segue, because I think we should back up just a little bit and say, what is a story as an experience? So how do I know when I'm in a story? And to be more specific, you don't align yourself with Coleridge's famous quote about the willing suspension of disbelief. You have a slightly different way of thinking about how you know you're in a story. Can you say a bit more about that? What makes a story, and how do I know that I'm in one or listening to one?
Yeah, there's. This is a difficult question because people have argued about this forever. Like what is a story? What is not a story? What is the gray area in between? The simplest definition of a story that most people would agree on it's an account of what happened. A story is what happened. Now, for it to be a story we care about, and a story that rivets us and actually pulls us in and holds our attention, it can't be a story like this. I woke up this morning, I walked to the kitchen, I ate some bread. That will rivet no one. That has no special power to grip our attention. And stories have. We think of storytelling as this kind of wildly creative, artistic genre. Even if you're telling a story like in a narrative history or in a book like mine, there's still an art to it. And in many ways, it is a wildly creative genre. But no matter where we go in the world, and no matter when we go there, we always find the same amazing thing. No matter how different the people seem. Those people, the Khoisan hunter-gatherers, seem very different than modern people. No matter how different they seem, we always find the same amazing thing. These people tell stories. On the whole, their stories are exactly like ours. The same basic obsessions around sex and death and power and status and etc. And the same basic structures. So what's a story? A story almost always has a character. The character has some sort of problem, some sort of predicament, some sort of trouble in their lives, and they seek to solve it. Stories are problem, solution, structures. Stories are not about people having good days. Stories are people have, it's boring.
That's boring.
It's interesting that it's boring, though. It really shouldn't be boring. Like, if you're going to enter into a mental simulation, if I said, hey, Richard, I'm going to give you a mental simulation, and I said, you can either go into this hellish landscape of this sort of story, or you can go into this hedonic paradise where everything is good and no one suffers, and you just have fantasy wish fulfillment. You might say, hey, I prefer that wonderful place, not that hellish place. But we routinely, regularly, predictably prefer to go into the hellish worlds of storytelling rather than heavenly ones. So I'll just go on for 1 second longer.
Yeah, sure. And talk a bit more about the narrative suspension. I'm not sure I'm getting the phrase right, but the sense of immersion.
That's what I was going to switch over to. So you mentioned Coleridge, and Coleridge is famous for many things, including his statement that that when we go into a story, a fictional story in particular, it requires a willing suspension of disbelief. So, you're reading Beowulf, let's say, and you say, well, I know this story about Beowulf is bunk, but in order to actually enjoy this, in order to actually get lost inside this narrative simulation, I'm going to turn off my skepticism for a while. I'm going to forget this is false, and I'm just going to enjoy the ride. But that's not really how it works. When it comes to suspension of disbelief, our own will has very little to do with it. If the storyteller is good, the storyteller just breaks into our mind and takes over. And the suspension of disbelief is something that they actually press upon us rather than a decision that we make. This is all tied into probably the best studied and maybe the most important idea or concept in story science, this new story science. It's called narrative transportation. And narrative transportation is this delicious, wonderful thing. It's one of our favorite things to experience, and we experience it all the time. So, listeners, today might have gone to work and they come home and they turn on Netflix or they pick up a novel they love and they mentally teleport out of their own mundane, boring, and perhaps quite painful realities and into these marvelous alternative story worlds. And people love it. But there's a couple of things about narrative transportation that bear noting. The first is that this is an authentically altered state of consciousness. It's a state of high rapt attention. So we all talk about short attention spans. Not during story time. We can pay rapt attention for hours and hours upon end if the story is good. But it's also a state of high suggestibility. People are more open-minded when they are in Storyland, which is the nice way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that people that tend to be a lot more gullible. They're easier to mold, easier to manipulate, which is why people like marketers, propagandists, con men, demagogues, misinformation and disinformation peddlers always work in terms of storytelling.
Yes, because you've basically softened us up in some way by drawing us in. But I wonder a little bit about this, the willing suspension versus the transportation, because we can all understand what you're talking about. Right now, we're late to the party, but my wife and I are binge watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, right? And like I suggested to her the other day that we just take a break. I think we just got through season 2, and I said, maybe we should just watch something else. And she looked at me with more distaste than I can ever remember, and I think in our marriage, it's like, what are you talking about? Because we're so invested in it now. And actually, I also do wonder.
Why did you want to take a break?
Or maybe it's because I'm reading your work, but I think it's just because, like, I want to control the degree of narrative transportation. I think that the danger, particularly with binging and so on too, is that the lines become quite blurry between your own world and the world that you're inhabiting temporarily. To the extent for me, it's if I start dreaming about what's happening in the show. Right. If my dreams start to get inhabited by Mrs. Maisel's comedy or What a Tang with Joel or whatever, then I think, okay, maybe it's time to take a break, Reeves. You know, maybe you're overdoing it. So I think I'm a bit sensitive to that boundary. But the thing I was going to ask is that we do usually take the step to open the book, turn on Netflix, etc. And so whilst yes, we get transported, it's not like someone turns my Netflix on for me or thrusts the book in my hand and holds a gun to my head until I've read the first 100 pages. Right. I am choosing. And so to what extent, so I know I am choosing to go into that transported state, and I can usually choose to come out of it too. I need to stop to go to the bathroom or get an ice cream or something. And so, so I just wondered at various points if it felt like you'd almost overdone the degree of transportation. It felt a bit like, Mesmer in the 19th century. It felt a little bit, sometimes a bit like you'd understated the degree to which we do have on-off switches. You choose to read or listen. Or go to the Tribesman, or the comedy show, or to turn Netflix on. Don't we choose that? We choose it and turn it off?
Oh, that's a good question. This is another question where I'd like to sit down and make some notes and do some writing about it, rather than
you have
talking
to say
about it off the top of my head.
You have to just say the first thing that comes to your mind, and then I'm going to hold it against you for the rest of your academic career.
I know. You won't, but somebody will. I am, when I talk about it in relation to things like hypnosis, I am analogizing, right? So it's not a perfect analogy. I don't even know if hypnosis really works in the way that we think of it as working. But if you look behind you in that theater, those people look hypnotized. I do also analogize the state of being under the influence of stories to being under the influence of drugs. And actually, I think in the book I don't analogize. I think I say that I consider storytelling to be literally like a drug.
It has the same physiological effects in many cases.
Having the same sort of physiological effects,
And it dampens your own ego in the same way psychedelics would.
But I am open to what you're saying. I was worried about overstatement, and so for instance, there's a massive physiological reaction that's occurring when we are absorbed in a story. And I tell this short story, this little 1.5 page, 2-page short story, a very simple scenario, a very cliche scenario almost, where you have this young woman menaced by a man, and she's kind of running and trying to escape. And I point out that if this girl were real and not just a literary figment, she would be having a really massive and powerful fight or flight response. And what's cool about this, though, is that if you were reading this in a novel, like a thriller novel, or watching this in a horror film, and a scientist came in and hooked you up to all the right machinery, they would be able to show that you, the viewer, you, the reader, would also be having a muted version of exactly that same fight or flight response. Your heart rate would be appreciably up. Your breathing rate would be appreciably up. Your hormonal system would be changed. You'd have more cortisol in your veins. You'd have more endorphin release, which would give you actually higher tolerance for pain, just like a person has during a fight or flight response. But I also, point out that, of course, it would be nothing like the same level as what you would feel or experience if you were the one who's actually going through this experience. Everything would be much more heightened. Now, then on the other hand, you don't want to understate the power of these stories too much either. One kind of area of research I'm really interested in is horror films. And if you ask people, hey, what was the most traumatic thing you saw in the media over the last 20 years? They won't say, it was watching an ISIS beheading video. They won't say it was watching the World Trade Center collapse. Most people say it was horror films. Seeing some horrible film, some horror film that actually scarred them and gave them, PTSD-like symptoms for oftentimes for years on end afterwards. People won't go into the ocean for years after watching Jaws. So you don't want to overstate the power that these stories have, but you also don't want to undersell it. And one thing that we're dealing with is that if it seems like I'm being a little bit imprecise, it is important to note that this is all very new. This is a very young and very immature science where a lot more is unknown than is known. And a lot of the stuff we think we know, maybe it won't hold up in the long run. Yeah.
Especially the overlap with neuroscience and social psychology and so on too, which is, it's absolutely fascinating work. I think one of the reasons I asked the question about the decision to kind of enter and exit narrative transportation is because I think it gets a little bit to how we should think about our own relationship to stories. And where I think you land is, and you say towards the end of the book that, you just, if you feel there's a story being told, you just try to take a deep breath. You try to see the story from another angle. You sort of try to depower the story in a sense. I think what we're trying to do is you're recognizing the power. You're trying to sort of depower it a bit. You can't take it away altogether. You're trying to say, okay, how can I consciously depower the story? And I think that's hugely important. And part of progress is to try and depower stories and think more rationally. But another way to think about this is, I know I'm going to be told stories. I know I'm going to live in a story. And so I'm going to be quite careful about which stories I choose to be told. I'm going to be quite careful about which stories I choose to tell my children. There's a reason why we kind of restrict stories maybe to some children. And I'm going to consciously try to choose to put myself in stories that I think in advance are going to shape me. Because we're all being shaped by stories, as you said a moment ago. So the question is like, how do I want to be shaped? What shape do I want to be? And then what kind of stories do I need kind of, shaping me in that case? And that might be one reason someone would choose, let's put a positive spin on a religious tradition, choose to enter into the story of a religion, because they might say, well, actually living in that story for a couple of hours on a Sunday morning is a heck of a lot better than a lot of other stories I could choose. And I'm choosing it. So I choose the stories that shape me. And it could be lots of other different stories too. And therefore, I have a degree of control over the power of stories over me. So I accept the power of stories to some extent. And then I just try to be more selective about it. Does that make sense at all? It's a different
strategy.
Absolutely,
yeah. I think everybody's doing this to some degree. Again, in some ways, I think you can look at the arguments in the books I've done on storytelling and see them as really profound. And on the other hand, you can see them as really banal. Like everyone knows this, And once you've had it pointed out to you, then you really know it. It seems really obvious. Why would this even need to be said? So what you're talking about choosing the stories that are going to influence you. We can see this happening right now in America, in education, for instance, where there's massive wars going on at the school board level about what stories we're going to allow into our curricula, because in the background, all of these parents, all of these teachers, all of these administrators understand that these have enormous shaping power. Now, what I worry about, however, is, there's a kind of a good side to all of that, and there's a bad side to it all too, because what will happen is that people like you, or people like me, or people like X or Y or Z will all decide to just stay marooned inside our own stories that are comfortable to us, that are consistent with our pre-existing biases, that are consistent with our ideological bents. And before you know it, people are living in entirely isolated, mutually conflicting realities. And I do feel like that's really I'm not the only person who feels that way, but I feel like this is really at the basis of so much of our political, cultural pathology, is we are living inside wildly different universes of stories.
Right. Well, of course, it's occurring to me that one of the worst things you can say to someone in some cases is, you've changed your story. And the idea of changing a story, of allowing stories to be fluid, of allowing them to grow, allowing one story, abandoning a story about the world or even about yourself is a really hard thing to do. And we know that from some of the psychology around beliefs. It's just really hard to get people to do it. But I wonder if that's even more true of a story. So you actually talk about the story of America very well. You have sort of myth 1 and myth 2. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I was trying to find the exact quote, but there's this fantastic description about one's a shining city on the hill and the other one's Mordor. And they're both kind of wrong. Can you say, in the context of these debates, about the story of our own history, and how you deal with the myth 1, myth 2 problem? Because as you say, by labeling them myths, you declare your hand that clearly they're both wrong. It's
right.
They're both wrong. So so there isn't a right history. There isn't a right story. So how do you tell a story of the nation, one that might help us to overcome some of our disunity? Because it's difficult. That's the tension, right? You want stories that help to create a sense of unity, but that are plausible and without going down one track or the other.
Excuse me. Myth 1 and myth 2. So myth 1 is the story of America that is sometimes referred to as American exceptionalism. This idea that we're this, uniquely blessed, chosen people. We are the paragons of freedom-loving, heroic, virtuous, this just a sort of whitewashed, glorified American history that might have been strongly dominant up to the 50s or something like that. And then in the 1960s, a sort of counter history of America began to form. I call it myth 2. And this is another story of American exceptionalism, but where America is just exceptional for its greed, its destructiveness, its violence, its buffoonish sense that it's the good guy when it's really the bad guy. So myth 1 is a very, very bright story of American history. And myth 2 is a very, very dark story of American history. And for the most part, the right wing of our country is living in myth 1, and the left wing of our country is living in this very dark story of myth 2. My own argument is that these are both mythologies, and what is accentuated in one is left out of the other. And what's needed is a sort of shuffling together of these stories into a new story that takes account of both sides of this. There is something special about our country. At the same time, there's been, obviously, a dark side to our history as well. And so, but the hope is to come up with a story that can unite the right and the left, because I do worry that, there's been all this talk about, basically the well springs of a civil war are beginning to percolate and bubble up. And this sounded very, I don't know how this sounds to you, but this sounded very hysterical to me when I first started my book, and it seemed less and less so as I went to work on it. But I do worry that we're kind of, that if we're not basically on the same page, something like the same page, that we're headed towards dark days.
Yeah, and I was thinking quite a bit about the particular role of story in American identity as compared to other countries, including my home country. And therefore, the stakes are higher around the story that's told, because to some extent, America is a story in a way that other countries aren't. Other countries are a race or a certain history or a very clear space or whatever. And that's just much less true of America. So without America is a story or it's nothing, I guess, would be the kind of blunt way to put it. And so what that story is then becomes kind of incredibly important. And if there isn't agreement on some basic elements of that story, then it creates a much bigger problem that for the US than it would in another country. I think precisely because the story is what's at the root in a way. I'm sort of thinking out loud here a little bit just to kind of get your response to it. So what that means is that if you lose this sense of, I think Benedict Anderson had this book ages ago called Imagined Communities, and he described nations as imagined communities. But in the US, it's a real stretch of the imagination, honestly. And so it makes the story even more important, and therefore maybe the fracturing of that story even more important too. And so we do, I think, well, I'll state this and see if you agree. I think we do need a story of America.
Yeah,
we do need one, and one that is largely agreed to by most people most of the time. I'm just not sure what that story is now.
Oh yeah, this is a hard one. Some actually, going back to writing versus speaking, I think some things are very hard to deal with orally. They're so complicated, and you need so many caveats, and you need such care and discussion, especially things with such high political stakes as something like this. But America is a story, you said, yeah, and I do feel like at bottom, what we are doing right now in America, we're talking about polarization, we're talking about a story war. We're talking about people, this fight is ultimately about how the story of America should and will be told. And when people are fighting on these school boards about whether or not we should ban these books, or whether or not, critical race theory should be taught, or some softer version of the story about American racism, slavery, and all that stuff, This is at bottom a fight about how we'll tell the story of our country,
and it's also not. It lacks humility, and I think that I see the need for humility running through your work, both in terms of recognizing just how much. I mean, you evocatively describe it as shit happens, and so a degree of humility about how we actually got here, rather than just retrospectively creating this story about it was all destined, right? And so I don't just that kind of intrinsic messiness and luck and misfortune. It's a horrible mess most of the time, and then we have to try and create a coherent story out of it. But the other aspect I think humility runs through your work is this sort of openness to amending our stories, opening up collating our stories, taking part of our story and adding another part of the story. It's more like a layering. It's like papier mâché, those things we just get bits of paper and stick it on with glue and then stick more. It's not one story. There's there's a fundamentalism to this story war. It's like it's this or that, and I'm not going to concede. As opposed to, the very terminology war, which you use in the book, does suggest winners and losers, as opposed to a story journey where we're merging and recognizing it. Because you saw on the left just absolute refusal to say that the War of Independence wasn't about slavery. Right, famously in the 1619 Project, and absolute refusals on the right to kind of recognize some of the real harms that were done too. And so there's a fundamentalism that creeps into storytelling sometimes, which is where things really go wrong, because then the story doesn't grow. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I guess, how should I...
How do stories meet each other and become new stories, I guess, is what I'm asking you. This is not
I don't know.
I'm being completely unfair.
Well, I guess, I do have some idea about this. But I don't know if it's plausible for it to happen. Our politics is so broken and everyone's so angry. But I get to the end of the book, and I've been saying largely dark, scary, negative things about storytelling, drawing us in a sort of dangerous existential risk sort of situation due to our failure to understand how the psychology of narrative works, and to understand how stories are warping our own minds and warping our own calculations and setting each other at each other's throats. And I come to this, but at the end of the book, I kind of come around to this surprising conclusion, and the conclusion is that we should continue to tell stories, not just because we're doomed to tell stories. We're storytelling animals. There's no way out of it for us, but because stories really do have this special power that people attribute to them. The power to enhance empathy, to create understanding, to build bridges across our divides of country and class and culture and century. But only if we can resist telling these stories in ways that are guaranteed not to work. So if we want to actually build bridges of narrative across these divides, rather than just blowing up the few bridges we have left, we have to, above all, resist this giddy and deeply human temptation to draw people on the other side of whatever the divide is as the flattened out one-dimensional bad guys in our morality tales. This is a very primitive and a very crude way of thinking. It's a very primitive and crude way of telling a story. And it completely characterizes myth 1 and myth 2. So in myth 1, if myth 1 is, this is the right-wing version of American history, it's people on the left who are the villains and the bad guys, and vice versa. This doesn't work. This is bad strategy when it comes to it's a good way of prosecuting a culture war, but it's not a good way of achieving the kind of social. It's not a good way of achieving social progress. It's not a good way of achieving the compromise needed for a democracy to actually move forward. It's a good way of prosecuting a war. And so what you'd have to do, for instance, if you're on the left and you're telling the story of myth 2, where basically people on the right are the bad guys and the villains and the Voldemorts of your story, you have to get people on the right to say, you know what? I'll come over and live inside that story where I have to be the fool or the buffoon or the vampire. They're not going to do that. They're going to say, no, I'm going to go into my own story world, and I'm going to make a story where you're the clown and the villain and the vampire. That's just how psychology works.
Yeah, you dehumanize them, put them into another tribe. And so what that means, I think, is that there is a limit, actually, to what we were saying a minute ago about the story of America and so on. Because if the story has to accommodate a lot of pluralism and a lot of diversity, then there are limits to how bonding that story can be. And one definition of a culture war is my story is going to become the basis upon which we organize our society. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how people never see it that way. The bad guy is always the one who has the totalitarian vision for society. If you think about Bond movies or Marvel movies or whatever, like the villain now is always like, I can see things you can't see. I'm making the tough choices to wipe out half the population to save the planet, or kind of whatever. And the good guys are always about friends and family and town. Yeah. And so it's always like small. They're doing the small stuff, the relationship, and it's the bad guys who are totalitarian. So it's occurring to me now that like when you use the phrase scheming, right? They've got a scheme, they've got a plan, and so the right think the left have got a plan to genuinely. And I have this in my own family. Think we're going to turn this into a socialist state where everyone's watching everybody and has a chip in them and all of that. And the left genuinely think the right want to create like a white supremacist society and deny black people the right to vote and Senate. But they do genuinely think that they have a blueprint. That's the word I'm searching for. That the story becomes a blueprint. Yeah. And everyone else has to fit into that blueprint too. So that's the limit, I guess. Stories aren't that good at pluralism, I guess is what I'm saying, right?
No, yeah. If you go back to these really fundamental questions, how did we become creatures of story? We have to take this back to hunter-gatherer days. And one of the it's a multi-part explanation. It's probably very complicated, but probably part of the story is that storytelling helped tribes form a sense of common identity, help people get on the same page about what the rules of the society were, what the morals were, what the values were, and just kind of had this sort of bonding function. We all believe in the same myths, we all believe in the same values inside those myths, but the negative side of the tribe bonding function of storytelling is tribalism. So they produce this sort of in-group amity, A-M-I-T-Y, and often also the cost of that, though, is out-group enmity, because in the very instance of showing what the in-group is with the storytelling, the good guys, the protagonists, it also has these bad guys, these antagonists, these outsiders, these people who are not part of the tribe, who it's okay for us to villainize, to hate, and even to kill. So one of the things I was most interested in during this whole project is, if I can just bring up something kind of related to this, As we think of storytelling, as I mentioned before, as being this very wholesome thing, it produces empathy. This is the most common thing we'll hear about stories when story is celebrated. It's celebrated by great artists, by thought leaders, even by research scientists who talk about this empathy-building capacity of storytelling. And this is all true, and it's all good, and it's all dangerously one-sided. Because this takes account of all this warm, generous, charitable feeling that stories can build in us, while genuinely not even seeming to notice that there's a much darker sort of energy circulating through the stories that we love. And it wouldn't be wrong to call that energy hate. We hate the villain of the story. We want to see this person punished. There's a phrase I borrow from another scholar. He calls it empathetic sadism. Empathetic sadism is this wonderful feeling we get from stories. We love it. When the good guy of the story either captures or humiliates or even kills the bad guy of the story. So exactly, this is a paradox again. The empathy-building power of stories is what makes stories such a good force for drawing us together. But at the same time, it's this villainization tendency in stories is also what makes stories such a wonderful force for dividing us and setting us on each other's throats.
Because you draw lines. I mean, I think, to be fair, even in this book, you do have some of those positive stories. You talk about the movement towards same-sex marriage, for example, being influenced by stories. You quote Biden saying about Will and Grace, but also a story I hadn't heard before. Actually, maybe you could just spend a couple of minutes on this, which was because it was so deliberate, which was in Rwanda. And the use of a show, NGO funded, I think.
Yes.
Dutch NGO. Am I getting that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And it seemed to kind of work. Could you say, because that, given the slaughter of whatever it was, of 1 million Tutsis or something, that was a particularly, stark example in some ways, of both points you're making. One is you can depersonalize people to the extent that you can slaughter them in those numbers, but then also how a show seemed to help heal the divide.
Yeah, this is part of the show you're mentioning is called New Dawn. And it was a radio soap opera that aired in Rwanda after the genocide. And it's part of a larger movement called entertainment education. And you'll find it mainly in developing countries where they'll on purpose create a show, often a radio drama or TV show, and build into it certain types of messaging, with the understanding that people will pay attention because there's a good story associated, where they're not going to pay attention to a public health message about AIDS or HIV if it's just a lecture. But if you work these messages into a story, people will pay attention. And I was interested in the New Dawn story because it got a lot of press. It got a lot of press in America as being this incredible proof of the power of story to do good in the world, even in situations as dire and difficult as Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide. And so what the show did was, basically was a kind of a Romeo and Juliet story about a romance between a Hutu boy, I believe, and a Tutsi girl. It might have been reversed, something like that. But, a forbidden love story across ethnic lines. And after listening to the story, which was intended to break down barriers between Hutu and Tutsi and show each side that the people on the other side weren't the drooling monsters they imagined. They were just like them. The same type of people. And they were able to show sort of statistically significant movement in people's attitudes of tolerance towards the other group. And this is all good. But there was this, what I was struck by was all this publicity that followed the publication of this research, because there was a research study on New Dawn, sort of just validated and said how wonderful storytelling is. Look what it did. Again, without even seeming to notice that the whole genocide was driven by storytelling.
Right.
There's this whole, there's a whole story built up, by a supremacist Hutu power ideology that said that the Tutsis were basically a cockroach people. That's the word they used for them, cockroaches. They were sort of an invasive species that had to be annihilated before the Tutsi annihilated them. And so there was a very clear story that drove the genocide. And also very clearly the negative power of story in this example was much, much vaster, much vaster than the positive power illustrated by New Dawn. New Dawn did some good, but it didn't heal all the problems in Rwanda, obviously.
No, and it didn't bring 1 million people back, of course. That's exactly why it struck me too, was because I guess, our desire to sort of see the positive power of story is so strong. That's part of our own story, I guess, that we don't necessarily see the negative part of it. I was thinking actually about some work a colleague of mine did, Melissa Carney, showing the impact of an MTV show, 16 and Pregnant, on teenage pregnancy rates, because it was shown at different times in different states in the US.
Oh, cool.
And so she had a natural experiment, was able to show that it had a much more powerful effect on teen pregnancy rates than any public health campaign. Like lecturing 16-year-olds not to get pregnant in high schools is not very effective, but a show which actually went through the lives of and the difficulties of it is back to your point about you inhabit that world. And there has the positive version of this, and you do again talk about this, is the rise of the novel and the ability to tell stories that get you inside the minds of other people. There's kind of interiority to it. Helps maybe not to create this sort of rah-rah, we're all amazing, we're all the same, but it does at least help to situate the idea of a kind of universal worth. Maybe I'm not going to be your friend or marry you, but I'm not going to kill you. Do you think story still has that capacity? With
killing the bad guy.
Yeah, but it's almost like you want a story that allows someone to be not like you and different, but not therefore evil and to be wiped out, right? It's like sometimes it feels like, I guess I'm trying to say, what's the middle ground?
Yeah.
There's the stories can bring us all together and we're all family. We're a global village, as you quote. We're one big family. We're all the same underneath. And these stories just show that, right? So there's this kind of... And on the other hand, it's like, no, they're cockroaches, or they're Jews destroying the world with their global conspiracy, or they're Nazis, and have to be wiped out.
Yeah.
But is there a role for stories in this slightly boring middle ground or not? Just because stories have to be exciting, and so you can't do the boring work of political economy, or like liberal democracy is just a terrible story. It's really boring.
Yeah, I do worry that the structure of storytelling isn't cultural. I think it's biological. I think we are inherently drawn to stories about protagonists. I put it in the book, something like, humans by nature need stories. Stories by nature need problems. And problems, almost by nature, but not quite, need villains to cause them. So for all the drawing together stories do, there's also a splitting apart. They define what good behavior is, and they personify bad behavior and the behavior of antagonists who, in order for us to feel good at the end of the story, have to be punished. We do not like stories when the villain is forgiven at the end. We do not like stories when the villain gets away with it, of course. And we do not like stories where the villain is rehabilitated at the end. We want them punished. We want them to pay for what they've done. And so I do worry that there are other ways of telling stories. For instance, you can just do without villains altogether. It's very easy. Just get rid of them. Because shit does just happen sometimes. Problems can happen without there being a human agent to cause them. An example of this I get into in the book is the film Babel. I think Babel is a great film. And there's no bad guys in it. Horrible things happen. The film is death-haunted. Everyone is, from beginning to end of the story, involved in a horrific predicament. Every single character. But there's no bad guys who caused it. Things happen, maybe there's there's inadvertent harm caused by people. By accident or by carelessness, something bad will happen. But no one is evil in the story. And so these kind of stories can be told and told well. And I hope people will start trying to tell stories that don't depend so much for their grip on the depredations of evil villains. I hope we will do this especially in our nonfiction storytelling, in our political storytelling, where we stop sort of personifying the other side as, you know, wicked demons. Both sides think the other side is out to destroy America.
Right.
What's more evil than that? What's more evil than trying to destroy America?
Especially given how important the story is. I was thinking when you were talking about that, the movie Marriage Story, which got quite a lot of attention, I think, partly for the reason you're talking about, because it was Scarlett Johansson and
Isaac.
Well, anyway, no, you'll think of Oscar Isaac, but it's not. It's the guy that plays. Now I can't remember the guy in Star Wars. He's brilliant. He's in everything.
Okay.
Adam Driver.
Oh, that's who it was.
I think Scarlett Johansson.
Yes.
A Marriage Story. And I think one reason it got so much attention is that it is this kind of incredibly intimate depiction of the end of a relationship.
Yeah.
In which neither of them done anything bad. Right. It's not a typical story, I had an affair or she's done this or whatever. It's just like, no, relationships end and it's painful and difficult and so on. I think actually it's one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives didn't really like it. Because it sort of just said, look, sometimes marriages do just, you know, for no one's fault kind of end. But I wonder also, and this is actually one of the things I did just want to talk to you about in our last few minutes, is I wonder if that's why you take this turn towards the end of the book to talk about the lack of political diversity in academia, which I was a bit surprised by, honestly. It felt I didn't see that coming when I was reading it. But you have these kind of statistics, which people will know if they've listened to Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy, and I've had Jonathan on here too. But some startling statistics actually about just how left wing the norm has become. And I guess it wasn't. Is that why you care about that? Why, from a storytelling point of view, do you care about the fact that academic departments are full of left-wingers now?
Well,
is it the dehumanization bit? Like,
it's
what's
part
the
of
problem?
It's part of it. I have multiple concerns about it. That I believe that section of the book is in a section called "The End of Reality." Where I'm talking about sort of the breakdown of any kind of common frame of reference, where we're just not living in the same reality if we're on the left or we're on the right. And I had just launched into a fairly shrill attack on the president at the time, Donald. And I was seeking a little bit of political balance, to be honest. I didn't want to be a partisan hack or something like that. You know, I wanted to say that this wasn't just a them problem. The breakdown of reality. This is an us problem as well, as in it's an everyone problem, left and right. And the statistics on the political bias in the academy are absolutely stunning, and they're absolutely shameful. Something like 40-1 Democrats to Republicans in anthropology, 33-1 in my field of English literature. In some fields like gender studies, there's literally no Republicans. I mean, just not one out Republican in the entire discipline, in something like 60 of the top schools in the country. Mm-hmm. And the problem is when you have this kind of when you get a bunch of people into a room and they're all on the same side. Well, let me back up a little bit. If you get a bunch of people in a room and they're on different sides of a debate, let's say it's gun control, they will kind of work their way towards some sort of middle position. I'm not saying that kumbaya will happen, but there will be some sort of moderating effect of different views in the room. But if you get a bunch of same-side people in the room, they don't move towards the most moderate position. They stampede towards the most extreme position.
They get more extreme. You quote Cass Sunstein's work on this.
Yes, exactly.
Very well. Yes.
Yeah, and this is what we have in academia now. We have people We have rooms full of people who are all on the same side, and they're all stampeding towards the most extreme sorts of positions.
Yeah, and that's a problem partly because of the story you then tell about the other side, and you.
Yes.
I mean, this is something that's kind of only occurring to me now, but when someone's telling a story about themselves or why they believe a certain thing, it's one of the things Jonathan Haidt always says, is that when someone says something that you think is preposterous or racist or kind of, don't just start launching into why it's preposterous or racist or whatever. Ask them why they think that. Talk to them about what they think. So in a way, so what we're doing is a story of their beliefs. Tell me the story of how you came to believe that.
Right.
And that seems to help in some ways of kind of accessing that, rather than just, well, you're clearly wrong and stupid and racist and evil or communist and whatever. And so I wonder if it's just harder then if you don't encounter people like that. So if someone does walk in, a pro-life Republican walks into a gender studies department or something. Yeah. Right. They're going to have a rough time of it, because the immediate assumption will be, right, you're only saying that because you want to control women and you hate women and whatever, and not the story. Like, what's the story of how you came to believe that? So we don't hear competing stories enough if we're in bubbles.
Yeah. And by the way, and once you say to somebody, oh, you think these things because you hate women. This is not a good public relations campaign.
It's game over.
It's game over.
Well, it's like
you just called me. You just called me a vampire. You just called me Satan. What kind of monster hates women?
Yeah, but we do. But you're right. We're turning. Arthur Brooks has this line: "When did our opponents become our enemies?"
Yeah,
and I think there's something there about the villainization. Yeah, and of course the president whose name you don't like to say.
Yeah,
it's quite funny. It's funny though. You don't actually use his name in the book. You call him the Big Blair. Yes. But Blare, I should say, for British listeners. Yeah. Not Blair. Is that he was a master of that, right? He was just all about the villainization.
Yeah.
Is incredibly powerful. But what you're seeing is what you're trying to say, I think, is that's true of both sides now. We're all in danger of villainizing the other.
Yeah. No, I think we're doing it. I think we're doing it. I mean, a good example of this would be like, a film that I liked very much because it's completely consistent with my politics down, 100%, is the film Don't Look Up, the Leonardo DiCaprio, Meryl Streep, comedy about, where it's sort of a allegory of global warming. A comet's going to hit the earth, but it's really about global warming. Maybe it's about, the pandemic and other things as well. But there's this, the film makes this horrible, catastrophic mistake in that it can't help, for satirical, comedic purposes, but make the bad guys in the story red-hatted Republican buffoons. And the people that they consider to be red-hatted Republican buffoons are exactly the people they need to persuade that global warming is a serious problem. And so they squander this opportunity to actually make headway in the debate about global warming, climate change, and so forth, by just preaching to the choir.
Yes, I'm refusing on principle to watch the movie on exactly those grounds, because so many liberal friends have just came and said it just tells you everything that's wrong with America, and it's clearly just vindicating all their priors. And what little I know about it suggests that it's just kind of horrifically ineffective and tribalizing, and just like if I watched it, I'm sure I'd be hate watching it now because of its caricaturing.
Well, it's very funny. And it's hard to resist for a comedic storyteller. It's hard to resist Donald Trump. He's very funny. Oh, it's very, very funny.
Certainly the anti-Trump forces are, I think, struggling to give up Trump almost as much as the pro-Trump forces, because he made such an excellent villain. But it does make me wonder a little bit about where you start your book and where you start your argument, which is that story is a form of persuasion. You use the word sway, right? We use the way we sway each other, and it could be I could be trying to influence you to sleep with me, or vote for me, or like me more, or whatever. But it's a form of persuasion, and you slightly wonder whether that's less true in the examples we've just given. You use the phrase "preaching to the choir," and you are even seeing people sorting their church membership according to their political affiliation.
Yeah, for sure.
So in that case, you're literally preaching to the choir. And so this problem of empathy and maybe we're using stories less to persuade than we were, less to sway and more to bond, more to self-preen, more to say I agree with you, more in the sort of second version of Sunstein's examples, more so that we can just pat each other on the back about how right we are and how wrong they are, rather than try and persuade people how right we are. We just want to be reminded.
I would agree with all of that. I think that's part of sway. I think part of what we're doing is trying to persuade someone to come over to our point of view, to leave one camp and join our camp. But part of storytelling, the sway of storytelling, is also exercised just to maintain our bonds, to maintain our tribal identities, all of the things that you just mentioned. Stories can be persuasive. That's what I'm saying. All that the storytellers who made Don't Look Up had to do was to do a very honest, very reasonable thing and put Democrats in that White House. Because did global warming not happen under Republican and Democratic? And then you could have had a work of persuasive storytelling that might have drawn people in from the other side. So the stories can, if we can resist telling them in the crudest and most primitive ways, stories really can be forces that build bridges and bring people out of their entrenchments. They're the only things that are good at bringing people out of entrenchments. So if I just tell people my arguments about, I don't know, abortion, they'll just turn off if those arguments are against theirs. But if I'm able to tell the compelling, emotionally drenched story that doesn't turn them into the villain of the story, then maybe I can make some headway.
Yeah. Well, I've kept you a little bit longer than I said I would, but that's because it was such a wonderful conversation. So thank you for your work in this space. I think the whole space is just fascinating. As you said, it's early stages, but I think understanding the evolutionary, the cultural, the neurological role of stories and how that overlaps with our politics is just, I think it's just really fascinating and important work. And your style, both, I will say, in writing, but also now I can say speaking too, is one of like a real endeavor to learn together and search and dialogue. And so in that sense, I think you appear to be practicing what you preach, which is great. And so thanks again for coming on and talking about your work.
It was actually it was great talking to you. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.